I've always been drawn to horror stories. It started pretty young with episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark and those Scary Stories books with the legendary artwork. I sought out other kinds of stories just as often. It wasn't just horror, but horror's always had this grip on me, this gravity that I keep falling into. As I've matured, so have my tastes, in all kinds of genres, not just horror, but I've always struggled to articulate what it is about horror movies that I like. To be horrified is to fear, to be uncertain, to worry, and those aren't positive emotions. I go to great lengths in my day-to-day life to not feel fear or uncertainty, and yet I and so many others seek this stuff out as entertainment. That's weird, right? Horror movies and books are reliable moneymakers. They are big business, not blockbusters, but consistent gains on not huge budgets. People go to horror conventions. People wait year-round in order to dress up as monsters in haunted houses for basically no pay. People love horror, and maybe we should talk about why more often. Which isn't to say this hasn't been discussed. I'm not claiming to be the first person who has thought about this. Horror has been in conversation with itself for centuries. One of the easiest and broadest explanations for why people are drawn to horror is the roller coaster effect. Triggering a fear response in a safe environment can be thrilling. It makes you feel alive. It seems a little counterintuitive, but there's pretty solid brain science behind it. Consistently across the animal kingdom, more complicated brains require more frequent stimulation outside of achieving survival. If you poke the survival center of the brain, that's a really quick way to get stimulation. And since we are poking such a primal emotion, might as well lean into some other primal emotions. It's easy to overcorrect when talking about why you like horror and get a little hoity-toity about it, because you are a discerning moviegoer. You don't like movies just for the blood and the gore. No, you like them because they're a metaphor for the human condition. And I love that stuff. Don't get me wrong. Deeper readings of media is like one of my favorite things in the world. But we should not discount the simple pleasures of some blood and gore. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, great example. It is a movie about the moral vacuousness of the American heartland, and it's also a movie where a guy waves around a chainsaw and goes, ah, la, la, la. There is nothing wrong with liking horror for the gore and the titties. I myself have read many a classic manga cause it had titties in it and I was a teenager. Base pleasures get butts in seats, on a budget, and no one should be ashamed of that. I do get a bit frustrated with the decade or so cycle of boom and bust where a new horror franchise comes out and gets like 8 sequels before people get sick of it, but the likes of Michael Myers and Jigsaw are undeniably part of horror history. They are building blocks that keep the medium flush with new audiences who will eventually bring their own fresh ideas to the genre. Would we have The Babadook without Nightmare on Elm Street? I don't think we would. Whether it be slasher movies, found footage movies, or YouTube creepypastas, cheap thrills are still thrills and people enjoy them ironically or otherwise. Slasher movies aren't really my personal favorite thing in the world, but I appreciate some blood and gore, and they often have a can-do attitude that I admire. There is one type of horror movie that I do not appreciate at all, and like many things in life, you can blame it on the French. In the early 2000s, a new film movement started that was eventually dubbed New French Extremity. These films were characterized by extreme amounts of graphic violence, nudity, and sexual violence. It wasn't only in France, obviously, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert, but I've seen a handful, and by my estimation, only the works of Julia Ducournau are any good. Most of the New Extremity films fall under a category that I call hot sauce challenge horror. Horror stories that exist entirely to be gross or upsetting to force the audience well beyond the realms of good taste for little reason beyond the thrill of doing it. Movies that emotionally numb film bros used to feel something after they got used to teens being eviscerated. The only difference between Eli Roth's Cabin Fever and Lars von Trier's Antichrist is a thin film of academic pretension. So far, I've mostly talked about horror movies because that's where I like my horror stuff the best, but I do dabble in other mediums, most notably horror video games. Horror video games have a unique advantage over movies where they can make you personally feel threatened using game mechanics. No matter how much a horror movie pokes at your fear response, it can never quite match the terror of running into shambling monstrosities in a tight hallway while you manually count how many bullets this encounter will leave you with. I've collected quite a few classics of the genre over the years. It's just something I take pride in as a collector, but I don't play them very much. Silent Hill 2 is, to this day, a high watermark for the genre and for video game storytelling. But it's also 6 hours. 6 hours of oppressive shadows weighing in on me. 6 hours of monster screams from the darkness chilling me to my soul, and I just do not have the time or fortitude to play this game very much. Even games that are more mechanically satisfying to play, like Dead Space or the Resident Evil 2 remake, that's a really good one, they still really jangle the nerves. They're horrible to play with, monsters jumping out at you all the time. It's everything that people who don't like horror say is bad about horror, and yet I still play them. Books are something I have less experience with in regards to horror. I'm an avid reader, but mostly of manga and webfics these days. I don't really go out of my way to read most books, and I know comics can have like really chilling artwork sometimes, but when it comes to books, they rarely give me that down the back spine chill that movies and games can do. I think it's because I can't be terrified of something that my imagination cooked up. Like, yeah, sure, someone else's words put that thought into my head, but my brain is still the one doing the image generation. One very definite advantage that books have over other horror media is that you can really get attached to a book character just by sheer virtue of the time you spend with them, and then you do not want them to die. You don't know if they're gonna make it. Books can just change main characters. You have no idea what the rest of the page count could be moment to moment, and that generates a real protective desire in you to see the character make it through this trial, and a good author will use that to get their hooks in you so you cannot put the book down. But enough about the mechanics of horror. I'm still circling around the why. Why play a game that is literally built around jumping you and making you stressed? Well, because that's not all it's doing. It's also telling a story, and maybe that story is something you want? Horror stories aren't just about scary monsters. Those scary monsters can be potent metaphors for the human condition. Yes, I did briefly mention the overcorrection that can occur down this thought train, but the truth is that horror only works if it has something to poke at in the human psyche. There is a difference between a Steve from accounting killing someone with a chainsaw and a guy wearing human skin for a face mask doing it. Context is king in horror, and smart writers know how to pull on that thread. The Babadook is a movie about a strange monster possessing you after you read a book. At least on the surface. The Babadook monster itself barely appears, because it's actually a representation of this mother's repressed emotions following the death of her husband. And it's not playing around. The emotions she has been avoiding are dark and disturbed and refuse to be pushed down anymore. But then, not long after, the context of the Babadook got shifted again into being a gay icon, because the internet decided it would be funny. This happens to a lot of horror characters. People co-opt them to use in non-horrific scenarios. I think people just like these characters and want to enjoy them outside of the original horrific context, but they wouldn't like these characters if something about the dark stories didn't appeal to them. For many horror fans, horror movies simply speak to their existing fears. It's a cliche to say horror fans are just working through their trauma, but it's not completely wrong. The world is a scary place, and it can be hard to explain why it's so scary, why you are so afraid sometimes. And then along comes a movie that just gets it. It's got the same fear you do, it understands you. Suddenly your fear, it isn't abstract, it's right there in front of you. Now that it's a spooky monster or a collaborative wiki, it's not so scary anymore. That's a powerful feeling, and so much of the horror fandom is people chasing that feeling. Horror can speak to all kinds of fears, and therefore all kinds of people. That's why the horror fandom is so hard to nail down. It's men who never felt like they lived up to patriarchy. It's queer people who've never felt like they've belonged. It's women who've never felt physically safe. It's teenagers overwhelmed with possibilities. It's old people feeling their life fade away. It's artists unable to wrangle their creative impulses. It's conservatives afraid of a gross other. It's progressives worried about systemic oppression. Everyone gets scared sometimes. Even me. I've got some fears that I don't want to talk about here, but generally I don't fear for myself. I've always felt pretty on top of my life. My fear is for other people. I worry and wish I could help, but it's hard. It's hard to help if you don't understand. So for me personally, that's why I keep coming back to horror. It's a learning experience. It's an exercise in extreme empathy. It's weightlifting for my soul. That moment of connection, of empathy is something I just do not get tired of. And it's why I'm gonna keep watching horror movies. Also, I like fucked up puppets and gore. I don't feel like I gotta explain that one. Ooh, that was fun, wasn't it? And if you like horror stuff just like me, stick around on this channel because tomorrow I'm gonna upload my list of the top 10 horror video games. I don't think, personally, that anyone is ever gonna top that old Game Trailers top 10 list of the horror video games as just like a video. The editing and sound work in that one is peak, but it's also really old. And the games are just really outdated, so I'm gonna try and correct that. And also, I was on another podcast with School of Movies where we talked about the Scoville scale of horror. So that's a really good episode. I recommend listening to it. Link in the description. Have a happy Halloween, babes!